Hi, folks. Welcome to Health Talk from Marz. It's out of this world. Welcome to another episode. In today's topic, I want to discuss one of my favorite movie documentaries called What the Health. This was a movie done in 2017 by Kip Anderson and Keegan Kuhn. So stay tuned. In today's episode, I want to discuss the documentary What the Health, a movie I've seen probably over 20 times, have recommended to literally hundreds of patients of mine. In this movie documentary, it goes through an amazing history of Kip Anderson and his health history. His grandfather and grandparents and mom and dad, many of them had heart disease and died at an early age. So Kip Anderson goes through a little bit of his experience of finding out foods that he grew up on that were linked to various pathological conditions such as colon cancer, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And in this beginning section with Kip Anderson, he goes through some of his research that he did on a fully plant-based diet and was learning that certain foods like processed meats were actually classified as class 1 carcinogens, which was probably a startling amount of information for the average person. And so he goes through various companies such as the dairy industry as well as certain meat companies discussing the role of some of their foods in various diseases, such as mentioned, diabetes and colon cancer and heart disease. So I'd like to discuss some of my favorite takeaways from this movie, What the Health, and try to get you excited about being more involved in a fully plant-based eating, whole foods eating regime. So one of the most important points that was made in the movie documentary, I thought, was a relationship of certain foods like chicken, for example. Chicken, number one source of cholesterol in the diet, which I was actually not aware of. The other thing was that number one source of sodium in the diet comes from chicken. So this is obviously stuff that, is gotten from various fast food chains for sure, Popeyes and Kentucky Fried Chicken, which they changed the name to KFC. And so these foods are a major contributors to various types of health problems that we're facing. One of the things that was very controversial is that Kip Anderson talked about the fact that processed meats, something that he grew up on, I grew up on them as well, such as bologna and various processed hams, classified now as class 1 carcinogen. So, that's something that was definitely created quite a bit of controversy when he made that statement, and especially when he had a couple of cigarettes on the plate of some kids linking, processed meats as the same risk as smoking cigarettes in a day. In addition, some other, I think, really important points were the relationship of foods and diabetes. So there was one particular patient who was on about a dozen different medications and was told that he would be required to take these medications for the rest of his life. And so during the movie, there's several segues into his process of eating a plant-based diet and actually getting off many of the medications that he was originally put on and was told that he would need to be on them for the rest of his life. So one of the things I think that's really critical and I think was made very astutely was one of the talks given by Dr. Neil Bernard. And in there he talks about the fact that diabetes is not something that's necessarily caused by sugar and carbohydrates, but it's really caused by fats. So we know a syndrome X or metabolic syndrome, one of the classic signs is elevated triglycerides. So high levels of fats have been shown to cause problems with insulin receptors. One of the first things that happens in diabetes is that your sensitivity to insulin becomes less and less, and you need more and more insulin. As your levels of insulin rise, you create more inflammation, you store more bodily fat, more visceral body fat, which increases your risk of cancers and cardiovascular disease. I thought that was an important point where he stated that the cookie contains both fat and sugar, and that the sugar lures you in, but it's the actual fat in the form of saturated fat butter that causes damage to the insulin receptors and causes the beginning of prediabetes and eventually diabetes. And so this, I can't stress enough. There's a Dr. Kempner from Duke University in North Carolina, basically back in the 30s, came up with the rice diet, which consisted of rice, sugar, and fruit. And he treated a number of advanced cases of diabetes and actually cured them with this diet. So I think that was a demonstration that it's not really the carbohydrate and the sugar. And I'm certainly not an advocate for eating sugar, and it's very addictive, but it definitely leads to overconsumption of calories and increased obesity for sure. And so a third point that I thought was really well done was an interview with the chief medical officer for the American Diabetes Association. In this interview, Kip is trying to get some information from the medical director of the American Diabetes Association, and he asks a question, like, is there a diet, for diabetes? And the, CEO, Dr. Robert Ratner, basically stated that any diet works if you stick to it. And we don't have at the American Diabetes Association a specific diet. And then right while he's saying that, Kip flashes up on the screen some of the dietary recommendations that the American Diabetes Association recommends, including processed meats and dairy products, which have been linked to diabetes. And so at the conclusion of this interview, you can tell that Dr. Ratner is getting more and more disturbed by where this interview is going, and he finally gets up and states, if you want to talk about diabetes and diet, I think then we're done here. And he takes his microphone off and then he starts leaving, which, and to Kip's credit, doesn't really get, defensive or upset, just is asking a simple question. And I thought that was really well done and was sort of inkling into not only the American Diabetes Association, but the American Heart Association, cancer groups and whatnot that have some vested interests in various types of foods and companies that sell certain foods like the dairy industry and the meat industry. So I thought that was really well done. A point that was made in the movie, which I thought was really well done, was about the environment and the fact that many of the foods that we eat, certainly in the pork industry, that many of these places where they raise pigs are done in poor communities, and there's a serious amount of runoff of both nitrogen as well as other toxicants. So as we know, most animals are fed a diet. 97% of animal agricultures, is being fed genetically modified foods. And these genetically modified foods have in them glyphosate. Glyphosate is an herbicide that's used in the soy and corn and canola industries to grow these foods, which are fed, again, in turn to the animals. The animals will urinate, obviously, the glyphosate they ingest, and goes into the water, particularly around the Mississippi River. There's a tremendous amount of nitrogenous waste that's basically coming from the animal agriculture industry, as well as glyphosate. And this flows down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico, where one of the largest dead zones in the world is in the Gulf of Mexico, clearly as a result of animal agricultural runoff. And so I thought that this was a really well-made point, and also pointed to the fact that areas where people are poor and of various types of ethnic backgrounds are particularly susceptible to these areas where they're raising all of these animals in not a very pleasant fashion. So again, I thought that that was really well done. And lastly, I want to make the point that there's too much emphasis on eating lots of protein. What we know from research is that the ingestion of larger amounts of protein increases your risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancers, especially animal protein. And so, one of the points that was made was it shouldn't be where you get your protein from, but should rather be where do you get your fiber from? Because fiber is something 97% of the US population doesn't even get the minimum amount. And that is something that's critical in the prevention of various diseases, including heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease. Mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression are also associated with a lack of dietary fiber. So I thought this point was well done. There was one scene where they had a bowl of rice and a bowl of broccoli, and they were talking about how much protein the bowl of rice and broccoli had, and it came out to over 100 grams of protein. And it was a large serving for sure, but the point was well taken that there's lots of protein in plants, and some of the strongest and biggest animals in the world are all herbivores. They just eat plants. Rhinos and elephants, giraffes are basically plant-eating animals, gorillas, to name some really big animals. And so I thought this point was really well done. And I would have stressed this point even a little bit further and gone into some more details, but that is something that you can read further on in another podcast that I did. It was a review of the book Fiber Fueled by Will Bulsiewicz, gastroenterologist. So I'm going to refer you to that podcast. So one last point I think that the movie does a really good job in discussing is, eating a healthy diet, lots of fruits and vegetables. This is something that only rich people can afford. And that, eating organic foods is really a, white, rich type of food that excludes most all minorities. And there's one scene where they go shopping for food, and these are foods that are basically unprocessed, and they go through the supermarket just eating regular foods, not organic and not specialty food items. And when they check out, and this was for a family of 4 eating for a period of a week, it came out to something like $24. And it's like, well, that was to me an amazing little stat. And it's just to go basically to show that it doesn't have to be this really expensive food that you need to buy, and they don't have to be specialty items. They could be regular foods from the grocery store. And if we take a look at CSA's community-centered agriculture, this is something that we know we can get food even cheaper. So what the movie does is it basically emphasizes that we all need to be paying more attention to our local food supply, not really cater to rich and fancy foods. And it doesn't have to be organic. Ideally, yes, organic's great, but we can eat cheaply and we can eat very healthily. At the end of the movie, there was one woman that was on 18 different medications, including anti-anxiety agents, one for her asthma, antidepressants. And, she gets sent down to True North, which is a fasting clinic down in California. She actually gets off of all of her medications. She loses a bunch of weight, and she feels better than she has in decades. And it was really, a very inspiring moment where Kip was interviewing her, and she was so thankful for being able to discover an alternative path, because the way she was going, she probably didn't have too much longer to live. And she was, again, on all of these medications and whatnot. So I thought the movie did a really nice job in presenting her case. They made a point in particular of talking about the fact that fish are loaded with mercury and heavy metals, dioxins, and microplastics, and that if you want to avoid these things, you need to eat lower on the food chain. They also mentioned the fact about antibiotics, as mentioned before. 80% of all antibiotics are used in the animal agriculture business, and that would come to about 28 million pounds of antibiotics, which basically get into our food supply if you're eating animal products. And they also mentioned the fact that hormones, which are linked to various cancers, are found naturally in dairy products and animal foods. So it's not something necessarily that's added. However, they do add genetically modified bovine growth hormones to various types of dairy cows to increase their production. But just naturally, animals have hormones. And so dairy has hormones, and so do all meats, and so do fish. So when you eat them, you're getting these hormones, and that will significantly increase your risk of developing various types of diseases, especially hormone-dependent cancers. So I thought they did a really nice job just discussing some of those finer points. So if you like this podcast, certainly I urge you to see the movie What the Health. I'm in the credits on the far left side, so I feel proud about that. But I think this is a great movie to see and to take notes on if you are at all interested in becoming more of a fully plant-based diet eater and improving your overall health for not only you and your children, but also for the planet and future generations. So thanks again for watching. If you have any comments, please list them below. Until next time, it's Health Talk from Marz. It's out of this world.